thanks again. I really appreciate you taking the time to share your wisdom with us. This is such an incredible time, and your research right now is just incredibly important. And it's, I think that must be, it's the beauty of this kind of research having such an important opportunity for it to be applied.
Here's to hoping that it can be useful.
Great. Well, I've got a bunch of questions that I wanted to discuss with you today. And some of these really hone in on your prior research and background as an academic. And so the first one is about where your scientific career started, which was in computational biology and systems biology, before you moved into the world that I'm in behavioral science and studying decision making. Can you tell us more about that journey and how that led you to be so fascinated with human behavior and decision making?
Yeah, totally. So I have certainly had a non-standard trajectory. In high school, I liked biology and I liked computer science, or programming basically. And so in college, I started as a computer science major, but at that time, the computer science, basically, I thought I was going to be cool because I liked writing programs, but it turned out it was all about proving theorems about how quickly a computer program could theoretically run. And I was like, that's not cool. Or rather, that's not my jam. And so I switched into biology. And I did this sort of computational biology research, which I thought was fine. Like, I didn't love it, but I thought it was fine. And then I got a job at a biotech startup after undergrad, where I was making these math models of electrical properties of heart cells, and playing in a punk rock band, and spending half my time at work booking shows and stuff like that, and being like, well, this is fine, but whatever. And then I decided to go back to grad school, and I applied to these, sort of computational biology programs because that's what I had been doing. And then my first semester in grad school, I took an introduction to evolutionary game theory class, which sort of made sense from the biology perspective because it was evolution. But really, I learned about the prisoner's dilemma, and I was like, oh man, this is awesome. This is so much cooler than anything that I've been studying before. This is the thing that I want to do. And there was an experimental economist grad student that was visiting the same research group where I was at the time, and we hit it off, and was like, oh, these math models are cool, but seeing what people actually do, that's really cool. And so I started doing experiments, and I was like, oh, this is really fun. And then I think I actually heard Josh Green, the moral psychologist at Harvard, on Radiolab. And I was like, oh, that sounds interesting. And I saw that he was giving a talk, and I went to it, and I went up afterwards and I said, hey, this moral psych stuff is cool. And he's like, oh, well, I just moved to Harvard. You should come to my lab meetings. And so I hung out in Josh Green lab meetings for 2 years without it having anything to do with anything that I was working on, just because I thought it was cool. And then after long enough, I was in it deep enough that I was like, oh, now I get this stuff, and I see how I can apply it to questions that I'm interested in. And so that's how I brought the sort of cognitive science, dual process, intuition, deliberation stuff into the economic game world, which is sort of what my thing was for a long time.
Can you talk a little bit more about those early days connections that you were making and some of the specific moral psychology challenges, and where, if it's okay to just dig deep in here, because that I find that stuff fascinating when those aha connections are made. To me, that's just such a powerful part of advances in knowledge when that happens. I'd love to hear kind of your early stage of wait a second, a little more about that.
Yeah, totally. So Josh Green, at that time, the work that he was doing was on these trolley problem moral dilemmas, should you kill one person to save 5 people? Sort of things. And he had been doing this from a neuroscience perspective, and what he was really known for was distinguishing between the sort of automatic emotional desire not to kill the one person, and the more kind of rational, deliberative, utilitarian calculus of, oh, well, actually, you should in order to save the 5 people. And so I thought that was cool or interesting, and I hung out in his group for a long time. And so I started learning this way of thinking about decision making of the sort of Danny Kahneman thinking fast and slow type perspective of, slow, careful deliberation versus sort of fast, automatic, intuitive responses. And what I had been studying was not moral dilemmas, but moral behavior, let's say. That as we're doing these economic games, you give people money, they decide how much to keep for themselves or how much to contribute to something that benefits everyone in the group. And I've been doing, looking at different mechanisms to get people to cooperate. And then at some point I was like, oh, I can use the same techniques that like Josh Green and company have been using to look at trolley problems. I could use that to look at cooperation. And is it that people are intuitively selfish and they have to use rational self-control to make themselves do the right thing, which at that time was the sort of dominant sense that people had, although there hadn't really been much research on it. But if you just ask people, like I would do a poll at the beginning of my talk, and most of the room would raise their hand for intuitively selfish, have to use self-control to make yourself do the right thing. Or is it the other way around, that people are intuitively predisposed to cooperate, but then when they stop and think about it, if it's a sort of one-shot anonymous situation where they can get away with being selfish, then thinking more makes them realize, oh, actually the rational thing to do is to be selfish, so I should do that. And I sort of thought from various sort of theoretical perspectives, I would expect the latter thing, which is if you think, where do your intuitions come from? Your intuitive responses, if you think about this in the way of your like heuristics and rules of thumb, it would make sense that the rule of thumb would be treat interactions as if you're going to interact with the person again, or you're being observed or whatever, because usually your important interactions are interactions with friends, family workers, coworkers, friends, family members, coworkers, people that you have future interactions with. And in those situations, it actually totally makes sense to cooperate. That is, it's self-interested, because if you don't cooperate today, then you face consequences tomorrow. And so it would make sense that we would internalize a sort of default of assume that there are future consequences. And so you should cooperate. And then if you stop and think about it, you might realize, oh, actually, I'm in a weird situation now where I can get away with it. And so that was my thing, is put them together. And when we ran those first experiments and I was really excited about it and I showed Josh Green, he was like, you sure somebody hasn't done this before? This is like the oldest thing in economics, the prisoner's dilemma, and like the oldest thing in psychology. And I was like, well, so I think that there's really huge opportunities for like productive new ideas from bridging fields and sort of taking tools from one field and tools from another field and putting them together. I feel like that's sort of really the essence of a lot of what I've done.
Yeah. And the other vector in this is applying research that's happening in academic settings to contemporary real world challenges. And that's yet another bridge. The process of science has no immediate obligations to quote unquote serve the world today. It's to build knowledge. I'm not inferring it's knowledge for knowledge's sake, but building knowledge is a lot of work, and making that next bridge to solving real world problems is a whole other set of tasks that need to be completed. And yet you're also very interested in that bridge between work in a theoretical lab space, but also applying that to real world challenges.
Yeah, totally. And that's something that's very much evolved over my career. That like at the beginning of grad school, I very explicitly was like, I just want to do things that I find interesting, and I don't really care about the application, like the sort of the utility of it. Because I started in this biology program, and actually it was like the year that I started grad school, my mom got diagnosed with cancer, and like a lot of the people in my program, because it was a biology program, they were doing like cancer research, and I like had this internal thing. I was like, I could do research on that, I just like don't find it interesting. And so like I'm making this conscious decision to be like, I want to do this stuff that I just find like really interesting and compelling, even if it seems like not necessarily useful. But then over time, I sort of was feeling more and more like, well, okay, fine, this is fun to do this random stuff, but like, if I'm putting all this time into it, it really should be something that matters. And I think also what was nice about both the prisoner's dilemma stuff and then the misinformation work that we've been doing more recently is that relative to lots of other things you could be studying, the gap between the theory and the application is actually quite small. And so it seems natural to try and bridge that gap. And I think also what I came to appreciate is that it is also really scientifically interesting and challenging to do that translation. And it's not like, oh, well, we showed something works when people play a prisoner's dilemma for $5. So like, all right, all done. We understand that one. You know, it's like, that's a little tip of an iceberg. And if you want to really if you really understand the psychology of what's going on, that means you should be able to implement it. And conversely, if you can't successfully implement it, that means, you know, in the real world, that means there are important aspects of the psychology that you didn't understand. And so I think people tend to see that, at least in academia, there tends to be the discussion of like, oh, you do the interesting, novel, basic science, and then you do the boring translation where you just take the thing that you already know and apply it in the field. But like, that the only person that would say that is somebody that's never tried to actually apply it in the field. Sorry, did I freeze for a second? That is, you froze for a second.
Yes.
Like,
yeah, and that was a great point that you were making.
All right, should I try it again?
State that, especially the last point that you made.
Yeah. So like there's this sense that like basic science, you do the like novel, interesting research in the basic science, and then you do the boring, obvious translation of, oh, well, we just apply it, this thing we already know, we just apply it in some real world setting. But it's totally not like that. And the only person that would say that is someone that has never tried to do the translational application work, because it's just like, it's not that easy, and you really have to understand the psychology in order to figure out how to successfully apply it.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Obviously, I'm a huge believer in the same thing that you are about the first of all, just fascinating aspects of applying knowledge to real world challenges. That also strengthens the quality of that science. You can't just answer one little question, and as you said, okay, right, there it is, we've contributed. There's the science itself advances so much through that process of application.
Totally.
I think one of the other challenges that we face is, so you've crossed that divide, from the academic walls into playing an active role in your research, responding to and growing by the real world. But I think we face some big, huge challenges the other way, where science and scientific institutions, and even the word, that's academic, all are pejoratives. And in the business world, being called an academic is not a neutral statement about one's profession. It's actually derogatory, because what it means is one is very theoretical, out of touch, even misinformed. Would love to start to back into talking about your research on misinformation in the context of understanding the barrier that we face in science being a two-way exchange.
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously the fact that most of the academy doesn't value translational or like applied work is, I think, the flip side of the fact that also the people doing the applied work don't really take theoretical work that seriously. And then I don't know, I could be wrong, but my guess is that if academics took the translational part more seriously and like cared about it, then there wouldn't be as much of a like poo-pooing of academia in the other direction. Because I think that essentially a lot of that is actually fair. That a lot of people in industry being like, whatever, that's academic, is not unreasonable, because I think a really large majority of what is happening in the academy is really extremely basic science research that it's not at all clear whether it translates or not. And people, as we were saying, aren't really interested in it, in that question of whether it translates. And so if I was a person that was running an organization and trying to make decisions, like the fact, I would want to know more than this thing happened when I had somebody play a prisoner's dilemma for $1, and then be like, okay, let me make business decisions based on that. And so I think that it's a two-way street in the sense of it's sort of is actually theoretically important for academics to go out and understand things in the real world. And also if academics want to have an impact in the world or want to have the things that they're learning be useful, that it's also critical that you go out and do things in the real world, because people in the real world shouldn't take it seriously if you don't, is my.
That's great. Let's build on that by talking about a couple of mandates that you have right now. So you actually are heading up the MIT Human Cooperation Lab. You're a director there, but also, and this is a separate entity, the Applied Cooperation Team. So they're two separate entities with two distinct mandates. I guess first, could you talk about those mandates, and then let's again talk about this bridge between theory and practice.
Yeah, totally. So the Human Cooperation Lab is my basic research group. It's all of the grad students and postdocs and stuff that are working with me, doing either work on cooperation or on misinformation. We're doing some combination of applied and theoretical stuff, but really the goal within that organization is publishing papers in journals and having impact on the scientific community. And then the Applied Cooperation Team is this organization that I co-direct with Erez Yoeli, who's an economist at MIT that he and I have been working together forever. And Erez is actually the one that introduced me to field experiments. And the way I got from doing just prisoner's dilemmas to like doing things in the real world was through him, which I'm extremely grateful for. And so the idea of the Applied Cooperation Team is sort of, as the name suggests, trying to really do applied work, take the things that we've learned in the sort of basic science context and work on applying them to real problems with real organizations. And so that involves some people from the Human Cooperation Lab and then also some of our other collaborators elsewhere, but that are really interested in doing the real world work. And so we have projects in sort of energy and sustainability, projects in charitable giving, projects in health, and those are sort of our three main verticals right now, although we have a little bit of stuff in criminal justice and a little bit of stuff in education. But our sort of main focus is our, like things that are, and I guess an overriding feature of the Applied Cooperation Team is not just that we want to do applied work, but that we try to have, to do work that involves public goods in some way or other, and also that is informed by a like really clear, motivating theoretical framework. That is, I think, one thing that often happens in the applying basic science to real world setting context is people are like, well, we've got a list. We just got like a laundry list of 1 million heuristics or biases or whatever, and let's see which one seems like it might be working here. Or like, I honestly think a lot of the time what it comes to is intuition. It's like, oh, we've studied, we've done lots of research in the basic science sense, or we know that world, and so now here's a problem. What comes to mind as something that might be useful here? Okay, let's try it. And I think that sometimes that works, but I think a lot of the time, our intuitions aren't really that great. And so what Erez and I try to do is have the applied work be really firmly grounded in a particular theoretical framework, which is this sort of centrality of reputation and reputation concerns to human social behavior. Like so much of our social life is dominated by wanting people to think well of us or not wanting people to think poorly of us, that becomes a really deeply ingrained part of human psychology. And so there are a variety of different ways that you can leverage that to get people to do the right thing, where right thing can be very broadly construed. It's sort of obvious in the context of donating to charity, and then it's like a little bit more of a stretch when you say installing solar panels. You know, there's some self-interested component, but there's also some, sort of public good component. And then also a lot of things in the workplace context, like essentially getting people to be good workers, is another version of doing something that is in some sense individually costly, but is beneficial to the organization as a whole. So like, getting people to do things that are not strictly mandated by their job description, but are helpful, like sharing information that they come across that isn't useful for them, but is useful for someone else in the organization, covering for people when they're out, all this kind of stuff that is a lot of what makes companies successful. And then also in terms of health, people think about health as an individual choice of like, oh, well, if I choose to not exercise or smoke or whatever, then that might have bad consequences for me. And that's a choice that I can make. It's my body, like, let me do what I want. And the framework that we think about for a lot of the health related things is that that's missing all of the consequences that your choices have and your health have for other people. Like if you get sick, then that imposes a cost on your family members. It imposes a cost on your employer. It imposes a cost on society at large. And so there's a lot of things that in the health domain that really are actually public goods. It's just people don't really think about it that way. And so our basic idea is across all of these different domains, you can get people to be more inclined to do the things that you want them to do by either making their behavior more observable. So if other people can tell what you're doing, then there's more essentially feeling of social pressure that you should do the right thing. You can even just give the people the sense that they're going to be observed without actually having them be observed, and that can tap into that same psychology. And on the flip side, if you tell them that other people are doing a thing or that other people think they should be doing a thing, that helps establish what the norm is, helps them understand what the sort of reputational expectation is. And even if they aren't being observed, it just creates this feeling of, oh, I should really be doing this thing.
Cool. I'm responding right now to a paper that's going to be published in the Journal of Marketing, and it is challenging the historical way that journey maps have been designed. Journey maps are a tool that are used by market researchers to capture a path to purchase, generally starting at sort of awareness of a company's particular product, and then there's different levels of steps, but that culminate in the purchase of this item, and then ultimately perhaps some repurchase behavior or satisfaction, some post-purchase activities. And the premise that they're challenging is that historically this tool, which dates back to basically 1925, has been captured as if it's an individual decision maker. And so it's kind of the operating assumption of this tool has been, what is the consumer's awareness, evaluation, decision criteria, what makes them finally, purchase it, and then how do they kind of, what governs their satisfaction. And one of the things that's nice about this paper's fundamental point is actually we're missing the role of others in informing our decision making. And so reputation and the signaling that comes from an activity would be another dimension to the work that they've put forward.
Yeah, totally. I think it's really important. I think the social element is often overlooked. And I think it really is like core to the human experience is social concerns. And particularly in the context of purchasing decisions or consumer behavior, like social concerns are, I would say, in many contexts, really the dominant motivator, much more important than almost anything else. And another thing that's important about considering the social motivations is it's not just that you can mispredict what people are going to do if you don't take into account all of the social factors. But also, the social factors are often things that you can leverage without having to spend money. That is, like, if a standard way that you get someone to do something is you create a financial incentive, that costs you money. But a lot of the times you can really influence people's decisions using these social incentives that don't require you to provide them with some material consequence, just like giving them information about what other people are doing, or giving the sense that other people are going to tell what they do. You can often do essentially for free, and they can have big impacts. That's like a sort of general theme in a lot of the applied cooperation team work, is comparing the impact of social incentives versus economic incentives, and showing how in a lot of situations you get a massively larger return on investment from the social incentives because they're so much cheaper.
Yeah. So we've got a very complex set of behavioral challenges in front of us right now around the public health challenges with COVID-19. One of them, for instance, is the use of masks. Love to hear your thinking there, and what are the things particularly that might help us to understand people's reactance to it, and also what should public health leaders try to do to help people who have maybe different views of the implications of mask wearing.
Yeah, it's there's a lot of different things going on in the COVID-19 context. I think there's sort of two different parts of it that we've been thinking a lot about. One is misinformation, and people just like, that is, in these public health challenges, it's particularly important for people to have accurate beliefs and accurate understanding of things, because if they just like don't believe the right thing, that can obviously lead them to make decisions that are not good for the society. And so we've been doing a lot of studying of COVID-19 misinformation on social media. This is a sort of natural extension of work we've been doing for the last 3 or 4 years on political misinformation, and like why people believe it and share it. And the basic thing that we found over a whole lot of studies is that in general, people want to have accurate beliefs, and people want to share content that is accurate. Or let's say they do not want to share content that's inaccurate. It's not like this post-truth world where nobody cares about accuracy anymore, and people are just purposely sharing all kinds of things that they know are false because it advances whatever agenda they have. That is, there certainly are some political operatives that are doing that, but like just the average person is essentially doing the best they can with what they have in front of them. But the problem is that in general, and in particular on social media, people tend to be distracted from thinking about accuracy. And so like when people stop and think about accuracy and think carefully about it, a lot of the time they can actually do pretty well. But the problem is that people don't do that, or let's say rarely do that. And I think the social media context in particular biases people not to be thinking carefully, because you're scrolling quickly through a million things. You've got sort of news-related content mixed in with pictures of cats and babies and all kinds of things where, like, you know, thinking rationally or carefully like doesn't even make sense. And also a lot of times people get on social media because they want to relax and unwind and not think carefully about it. And so I think that predisposes people to essentially just forget to think about, is this accurate or not, before they decide to share it. And so what we've been doing is showing that, basically providing evidence for that account of why people share misinformation, and also evidence that it's actually the dominant reason, and it's more important. It explains a lot more of sharing than purposely sharing misinformation, or at least in our experiments, more than confusion. And so basically the implication of that is that if you just nudge people to think about the concept of accuracy, then it makes them more discerning in their subsequent sharing, because if they think about it, they can typically tell what's true, and they don't want to share stuff that's not true. And the problem is just them forgetting to think about it. So you get them to think about it a little bit, and they're more discerning in their subsequent sharing. We show this in survey experiments, and we also did a big field experiment on Twitter where we messaged thousands of users, just asking them to rate the accuracy of a single random headline, not anything that they'd shown before, just some random thing. The idea is just rating one headline for accuracy makes the concept of accuracy top of mind. And then when you go back to your feed, you're more likely to be thinking about accuracy. And we found a significant improvement in the average quality of the news that they shared after receiving this nudge. And so this is something that we're talking to various different social media platforms about, being like, come on, guys, you should be so happy about this, because it's a way to improve quality that doesn't rely on a centralized authority saying this is true, this is false, and so on. It just kind of gets people to take on a little bit of that burden themselves. And so I think in the COVID context, it's particularly hard because it's scary. And when you get people into this emotional mindset, like, they're really anxious, whatever, that again makes you less likely to stop and think carefully about it. And so I think one of the challenges there is just getting people to slow down and think carefully. And another major challenge is that, so one source of misinformation is weird random websites, conspiracy theory websites, pushing or supplement manufacturers pushing bogus stuff. But it's a very different thing when you have the president of the United States or top party leaders of your party directly stating misinformation. And we've found actually that really undermines people's ability to tell what's true or not. If you have sort of elites of your party espousing misinformation, it makes people much more likely to believe it, even when they stop and think about it. And so I think that it's not really something that we can directly act on, but I think that is a huge problem with COVID, is that the government in the US in particular has really been bad about providing misinformation and conflicting information and not having a set story. And that is obviously, as the science changes, you want the narrative to evolve in response to the science, but that's not what's been going on. And I think that's also huge in the face mask context, because I think that there was some serious problems with the messaging. And this isn't even the Trump espousing conspiracy theories thing, but I think this was maybe a strategic decision when they were worried about mask hoarding. And they said, public shouldn't wear masks, only the health workers should wear masks. And the messaging was not super clear. And I think a lot of it said, it doesn't help you. Rather than saying, don't buy masks because it's a hoarding problem, they said, don't buy masks because it's not useful. And then they were like, well, no, actually, okay, now it is useful. Everybody has to wear a mask. And I think that really undermined a lot of the credibility. And I think also something that was problematic is that there was mixed messaging around the extent to which masks are helpful for you versus helpful for society. So this kind of don't get it or don't spread it framing, which is something that we've done research on sort of prevention behaviors in general for COVID-19. And our research suggests that the don't spread it framing is as effective or more effective depending on which study and what time. Basically, we have found a difference at the beginning of the pandemic versus the sort of middle of the pandemic. But in both cases, we found that concern for the community was a much stronger predictor of prevention intentions than, that is, the extent to which you thought COVID was dangerous to the community was a much stronger predictor of your prevention intentions than the extent to which you thought COVID was a danger for yourself. And accordingly, the messaging that emphasized the don't get other people sick was as good or better than the messaging saying don't get yourself sick, which is, I think, surprising if you're not thinking about this from a social perspective. If you're thinking from just a standard self-interest perspective, it should be well, saying don't get sick, that should really be the thing that should be the most motivating. But it's quite clearly not. And I think that has been problematic with masks in particular, as I was saying, because it is almost all of the benefit of the mask is preventing you from getting other people sick if you are sick. There's almost no benefit to you individually. It doesn't prevent you from getting sick from other people. I mean, maybe a teeny bit, but that's not really the main.
I think it's a little bit higher than a teeny bit, but it's not a guarantee, and that's your point. And the skew is definitely towards the helping of preventing the spread versus protecting self. I think it is higher than a teeny bit, but But your
I mean,
point,
also, I guess it depends on the mask,
and
you know,
all
because like if
that,
you're wearing an N95, like
yeah,
that's a real thing. But anyways, I think that like well, and I guess this also emphasizes an issue here with COVID-19 is that it's complicated, right? And there's a lot of ambiguous information, and it's also not super clear what authorities to trust, because I think that there's a concern about politics influencing what scientific information gets shared. And that is like really, really unfortunate that it went down that road, because it didn't need to have, like COVID wasn't necessarily going to get politicized. But I think that like Trump really politicized it, and that was bad. And now we're trying to deal with the consequences. Yeah.
I have so many follow-up questions. I need to start with one. I want to talk about the research that you did on accuracy, and just to build on some of the comments that you said about the context of social media kind of primes us to not be in that headspace where we're really thoughtful about what we're reading. And I want to talk about people that do seem to spend a lot of time researching, looking for, trying to understand, and then convince others about, alternative explanations, or what we call conspiracy theories, but they would say is alternative explanations. And there's a tremendous amount of passion and good intent in this research and this surfacing of these other ideas. And we need to watch out for big pharma. We need to watch out for big government trying to put controls in our life. I'm trying to not make a straw man argument out of this, so I'll do my best to try to represent the concerns. So we need to be careful of entrepreneurs like Bill Gates, who's a billionaire with a tremendous amount of power he can wield. So the intention there, as I understand it, is very well-meaning, and the desire to help others see these threats again is well-meaning. And so there's a lot of time hunting into the more obscure parts of the research world. What I really want to hear you talk about is, how do you bring somebody back? That's what I want to talk about. I want to talk about, what do you think about how you bring people back?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think the short answer is we don't know. Or let's say that's not something that we have sort of directly interrogated yet. We have done research on why people believe conspiracies in general, because like a lot of our work on misinformation and fake news, like the result that we keep finding again and again is that people who engage in more thinking or getting people to think more causes them to have more accurate beliefs. It makes them less likely to believe false or misleading claims. And that seems at first blush sort of inconsistent with a lot of the conspiracy theory world, because as you're saying, a lot of conspiracists really seem to be doing a whole lot of very careful thinking and digging and whatever. And so there is this a narrative that that some people in academia have proposed, that like what conspiracy theories do is they weaponize critical thinking, and they make it so that like the problem with conspiracy theories essentially is people thinking too much. But I was like, I don't know, that doesn't really sound right to me. And we were like, I bet that what the conspiracy theories are doing, because also conspiracy theories sites try to tap into this, because they're like, you're no sucker, you're not like all the rubes out there that just believe everything they're told. You're a critical thinker. We're going to give you like the real thing. And what our guess was that what's going on is that conspiracy theories appeal not to people that are actually good critical thinkers, but people that like to think of themselves as good critical thinkers. And more generally, people that are overconfident And so that are like, I know because if you think about a core part of being a conspiracy theorist is basically being like, I know better than everybody else, right? Like everybody else are sheep, but I really know what's happening. And so we've run a series of studies where we had people's beliefs in conspiracies, both like classic JFK style conspiracies and modern conspiracies. This was pre-COVID, so we haven't done it for COVID conspiracies, but you know, we went out like a year ago or something like that. So a lot of the like, you know, the various like alt-right type conspiracies, and also stuff on the left that you were talking about. But you know, like QAnon and for some of the like right stuff. But anyways, what we did, we assessed how much people believed in a bunch of conspiracies, and then we had them do some measures of critical thinking, where, you know, we sort of give them a bunch of math problems and word problems and see how well they do. And then we asked them, how well do you think you did on the test? And what you see is if you predict conspiracy belief using both actual performance and self-estimated performance, there's this totally opposite relationship where the better you actually do, the less you believe the conspiracies, but the better you think you do relative to how you actually did, the more likely you are to believe the conspiracies. And then we also did some other thing. We just had them do some essentially impossible tasks. We showed them random images and they had to guess what was in the picture, but there was no way to actually do it. And so basically everyone was just at random. And then we said, how well do you think you do? And same thing, the people that are sort of overconfident in their own abilities are particularly predisposed to believe conspiracies. That is, it's the combination of being overconfident in your abilities and not being a good critical thinker are the people that really believe the conspiracy theories. And so I think it's essentially people that like think highly of their ability to understand things and then like go down these rabbit holes without realizing like, oh, actually this is probably bogus. And I understand that saying that sounds like super elitist, but like, you know, I don't know what, yeah, I don't, basically I think that the conspiracy theories are just like, pulling in people that are thinking a lot but not thinking in the right way. And so what we're looking at right now actually is research on how do you get, like, if you find people that already believe conspiracies, to what extent do some of these like accuracy nudges and things like that we've done in the context of the general population, how well does that work among conspiracists? And so we're actually about to run our first study on that like this week. So I don't have an answer yet, but I don't know, it's hard because we also have a bunch of work on the what you might call confirmation bias. That is, when you're presented with new evidence, you assess it in light of everything you believed before. And if it doesn't line up with what you already believed, then you're likely to discount it, which a lot of people paint as a bias and some kind of, you know, misfiring of reason, but actually in a lot of cases it's perfectly rational, which is that if you have uncertainty about how reliable the source of the information is, then when you get a piece of information, you're trying to sort of do two things at the same time. You're trying to say, how much should I believe this information? And how reputable is this source, or how reliable is this source? And if a source that you don't know that well, or that you're not sort of sure about how much you should trust it, tells you something that's inconsistent with everything you believe about the world, it's actually like perfectly Bayesian, rational, you know, to say, probably more likely that this source is garbage than that everything I know about the world is wrong. And so even if people are trying to be totally truth convergent and like doing the best that they can, once you get a certain set of beliefs established, it becomes much harder to get them out of that hole.
So just to talk about those interventions then that could make a difference around helping to encourage humility then. So if there's already a predisposition to believe that my source is more accurate, then should we get at the root cause around overconfidence by engendering humility and allowing that more willingness to doubt oneself without it threatening one's perception of oneself overall, even as potentially being a critical thinker and keeping that, but going after the overconfidence and engendering humility. What do you think about that as an intervention possibility?
It certainly seems plausible. It's something that we've been thinking about. The one particular way of thinking about this is this cool sort of, at this point, classic cognitive psych result from Frank Kyle at Yale and some of his colleagues, called the illusion of explanatory depth, which is, people think they understand things real well, and then if you ask someone to explain it, like, what they did some of this with people right after they finished taking chemistry, like Yale undergrads, and they say, how well do you understand the Krebs cycle? And they're like, oh yeah, I understand it. And they're like, great, explain it to me. And they're like, actually, I have no idea. Or like, how does an engine work? I was like, oh yeah, I think I know how an engine works. Okay, explain it to me. I don't know, something explodes. So, and then afterwards, people sort of have a much better sort of understanding of their own limited understanding of the world. And so there has been some research on using the illusion of explanatory depth, that kind of paradigm of being like, oh, okay, you think that, that Hillary Clinton was running a child sex ring out of like a pizza store? Like, how would that actually work? Like, why would she want to do that? Like having people unpack stuff like that, it seems quite reasonable to expect that would then make people be like, oh yeah, okay, maybe that's actually not so true. And I've seen a few studies on this where the evidence is mixed. Like sometimes some people have found that to be reasonably effective, either on conspiracy beliefs or also on reducing polarization, and just making people sort of less extreme in their political beliefs. But then other things haven't really replicated those results. So I think the jury is out. I feel like that's one of those things that makes a lot of sense, and whether it actually works or not is to be determined. But people are actively working on that question.
Yeah, and it's incredibly important area of research to approach systematically, given that we seem to be doing a very poor job of having healthy debates with one another. And if we don't understand the role of bias and logical fallacies, then how can we have a good and reasoned debate? And one of the challenges is if we launch into doing ad hominem attacks, that doesn't help advance anything, but taking a calm approach of saying, how does that work? Maybe I'm missing something. Can you explain how that works? And could help us allow much more civilized discourse. And maybe there are elements of truth in another perspective that neither would have seen, because the debate was staying at that polarized level, as opposed to finding where some of the either underlying intention is actually aligned, or just helping the person realize, oh wait, here's where I'm wrong. I don't actually understand how this particular mechanism works. I'm making assumptions, right. And so now I can update my beliefs. But everybody,
totally.
Everybody gets to keep the label of being a critical thinker and wanting to help others and sharing information. We're all educators and teachers and noble in our intent, but now we can work our way through improving the quality of our discussions.
Totally, and I think actually like an important element in that vein is that, over the last few years, I've started really trying to understand polarization and like how it is that people can have really dramatically different beliefs, not just about what to do, but about basic facts. I think that a lot of the standard narrative is around cognitive biases and motivated reasoning, and things like that, of people like tricking themselves essentially, so that they can protect their identities and so on. But I actually am much less convinced of that than I sort of was at the beginning. And I really think that in general, people are trying to do like good, accurate reasoning, like trying to have accurate beliefs. And the issue is that they're starting with different information inputs. That is, like, if you have one person that only watches Fox and you have another person that only watches MSNBC, and then they take that data that they're receiving as an input and they, in a completely rational, not at all biased way, form beliefs and update those beliefs, they're going to come up with completely different understandings of the world. And I think that that can also help you understand when you are having a debate with someone from the other side, if you understand it not as that person is stupid because they believe that crazy thing, or that person is, willfully ignorant that they could believe such a thing. Be like, oh no, imagine if I was getting the input stream that they were getting, like, I would see the world very differently. And so I actually, like, years ago, signed up for the news alert emails from the New York Times and Fox. And it has been extremely informative to see the difference in, like, both what they're covering and how they cover the things that they both cover. And to be like, oh yeah, if you were only reading one of these and not the other, you would come out at a totally different place, even if you were absolutely doing your best with no bias and so on. So, yeah, I think that, and that I think is not something that you can lay at the feet of social media. I think that there is just, like, a lot of essentially consolidation in the media market, like both on TV and talk radio, where, like, people only listen to or watch the stuff from their side, and that causes, real issues.
Yeah, and I think another challenge might be the underlying assumptions about the long-term consequences of a particular solution. And so it becomes difficult to agree on the means because, for instance, if we believe, if we have a fear of big government because of prior experience to corrupt governments, then that assumption travels with you even when you're in a place where there's, reasonably trustworthy government. Like, let's say in Canada, where we have a reasonably trustworthy government, whether you think that taxes are too high, etc., it's still a reasonably trustworthy government. And if someone has prior experience in a country where the government was very worthy of distrust,
right,
it's hard now to accept in that different context that, for instance, public health initiatives don't have some sort of ulterior motive around, control, and then, leading people down a potential path of more control.
Totally. I mean, and I think that that's also actually a big element in the US, which is that for, at least the last decade, the right has taken the position that the government is not trustworthy. And and basically the information input that people that has been, sort of sent out by Fox and right-wing radio is the government is corrupt and, drain the swamp and stuff like that. And so it has created, I think, a very different understanding even within the US of how much the government is trustworthy versus corrupt. And that ties exactly into what you're saying, is that when then you're called on to trust the government or, like, do this thing that the government is saying is a good idea, but that you don't feel like doing, it's very differentially, going to impact you based on how you see that.
And it makes the discussion just that much more complicated. So this leads me to my, unfortunately, my final question, just given the time that you have, which is around the role of experimentation and using that to help inform public health positions, both to help inform public health policy, but also to help inform, specific communications or mandates that are given to public health. In particular, I'd like to talk to you about the benefits and drawbacks of using a tool that we use all of the time at BEworks, which is Mechanical Turk. We don't always have access to randomized control tests, and sometimes it's the best we have compared to nothing. And sometimes we have the advantage of being able to use it on the path to randomized control test, or one of many inputs that we then start to triangulate. That's the best. When we're talking to public health leaders, though, there's an impatience around experimentation, and I'd love to have you help sort of unpack those challenges.
Well, okay, yeah. So I'd love to talk about it. To clarify, in terms of the impatience, there's at least two different things that I have heard people raise concerns about, and I'm wondering which or of them you are sort of particularly thinking about, or both. Where one is an ethical objection to randomized trials. Period. Like that is, there's been a bunch of work on people sort of not like thinking it's wrong to do A/B testing, essentially, even if it's unclear which thing is going to be better because you're sort of using people as guinea pigs or something like that. And then the other thing is the extent to which you can make inferences from survey experiments run on MTurk to the extent to which that generalizes to actual things in the real world.
So the resistance is to running experiments at all because there's no time, and let alone Mechanical Turk being a, flawed but better than nothing platform.
Yeah, I see.
Or running a campaign on how to position wearing a mask, and you don't have time to run a randomized control test. So do you just go with what you think is going to work, or beg for a few days?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, yeah, I think that one place that, particularly like the online experiments, so Mechanical Turk, I've actually stopped using Mechanical Turk for a lot of stuff and have shifted to using more representative samples, because I think that particularly for the things that involve politics, who is on MTurk is not representative. And so like you can really miss out on things that are, but politics and also ethnicity. And there are some other alternative platforms that are like roughly the same price as MTurk and the same speed as MTurk that give you quota matched samples on age, gender, ethnicity, and region. So we've really shifted to that. This is sort of maybe more technical point. But I think it is actually important because it at least a little bit increases your confidence that whatever you're finding is going to generalize. Like the more representative the sample is, the more sort of you can claim some hope of generalizability. But I guess I would say one way of thinking about the experiment is like, if you have an intuition about how something is going to come out, then you can, in a day, build and run an MTurk experiment or a, whatever kind of online survey experiment with a couple of thousand people and like see if you're right or not. And like, if you think your intuition is right, like, then it should also play out in that context. I mean, I think a major limitation, obviously, is the hypothetical, like if you want to study behavior adoption, like wearing masks, like the only thing you can do on the survey experiments in general is say, would you wear a mask? And like the extent, or whatever, and the extent to which that translates into how people actually wear masks is like, somewhat up for debate. But like, I guess I see it as a useful part of the toolkit that has the advantage being that it's very fast and it's easy to get a lot of people and test things very quickly. And yeah, I don't know. I think if it's a thing where if you see like a meaningful difference between, that is okay. If you're a practitioner, you've spent a long time, you know your population really well, and you have a really strong intuition one way versus the other, and then you see an MTurk experiment that comes out differently, I think it's not unreasonable to say, well, you didn't do it on my people. Like, I know this group that's the relevant group. Like, I really know what's going on. I don't think this would generalize. Like, I don't think that's unreasonable, but like, I think it should, it should impact your thinking a little bit, and particularly in cases where you don't have that strong of an intuition, where you're like, I don't know, I've got a bunch of these different things. It's not super clear which one I think will work better, so I can just pick one, or I can find out, honestly in a few hours. Like the thing that's great about these survey experiments is they're really fast. And so I would think, particularly in cases where there's not like a really strong intuition about which thing is going to work better, it seems like a good idea to test things to use online survey experiments as a way to just to adjudicate between things that otherwise you don't really have a good way of guessing about.
Yeah, so I think we're completely aligned on make sure that your sample size and population is representative. And sometimes that means in Canada or other areas that you're going after, you need to be prudent in terms of how you're approaching that. Research that and awareness of not only your own research, but prior research that's been done is a very careful and deliberative process. So just because you came up with this idea today and you could run a fast experiment doesn't mean that you're qualified to rely on that unless you've got extensive knowledge as well as awareness of the research that's already been done to date. So our assumption here is that there's qualified research and awareness that has already led to this point. So it can't be like, oh, hey, I'm into this thing and now I'm going to run this experiment. Oh yeah, look, it confirms my hypothesis. Great, we're done. So we should be very, very vigilant in making sure that we understand that in some ways what we should be looking for is disconfirming and spending more energy disconfirming our beliefs when we're using this precarious tool. And then we also need to understand if we're looking at beliefs and perceptions, maybe we can get some reliability so long as we're careful with our expectations there. But the further we get into behavior, the more cautious we need to be. And to that end, we believe in using behavioroids or other forms of proxies for real behavior. So it's, I can't necessarily measure you wearing a mask, but I can ask you to take a picture of, you know, where do you keep it in your house and is it near your door, or here's an offer to get a mask, and seeing what that interest is in that and finding other proxies besides just purely relying on people, do you wear a mask every time you go out?
Right.
So those are four of many principles that need to be leveraged to make the platform worthwhile.
And you know, so one other thought just to interject on that is, I saw this interesting meta-analysis comparing the size of public health interventions on actual behavior versus self-report behavior. And what it found was like overall not meaningful differences. And the argument was there's all kinds of, that is, there was presumably differences between that's if like how a person self-reports their likelihood of doing a thing and how likely they are to actually do it are not the same. But depending on what the intervention you're looking at is, it could still, if you're just looking at how much do you move from that baseline, in a lot of situations, the movement may be the same. And I think the one place that that's not true is if the interventions differ in the amount of social desirability that are going on there, then yes, you know, you may get differential movements in the self-report versus the real world. But I think in a lot of interventions, there's actually, even if you think the self-report measure isn't great, it may still be that the movement is going to be the same in self-report and actual.
Yes, yes. All the more reason that designing these experiments requires a scientific approach. And with these considerations, then it can be done quickly and it can give us more grounded insights of what might happen or what might backfire than just purely relying on our intuition alone.
Totally. Yep, totally.
Thank you so much. I'd love to keep talking, and your insights are incredibly valuable. Where would you suggest that people go to help advance their knowledge of some of the research that you've been doing?
If you go to my like lab website is just daverand.org. Has links to all the stuff and videos and talks and all that. But so it's been a really great pleasure. Thanks so much for the invitation. Really interesting conversation.
Awesome. Thanks very much.